สวัสดีค่ะยินดีต้อนรับทุกท่านนะคะกลับเข้าสู่ IAOC Series นะคะซึ่งครั้งนี้เนี่ยเป็นความร่วมมือกับ IAEA นะคะในการจัดทำIAEA Expert Mission Strengthening Optimization in Radiological Practice นะคะซึ่งในธีมครั้งนี้เนี่ยเราก็จะมีการพูดถึงเรื่องหลายๆเรื่องนะคะเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของ National Radiation Dose แล้วก็ในเรื่องของการ Optimization Technique ต่างๆนะคะครั้งนี้เนี่ยก็ยังเป็นอีกครั้งหนึ่งที่เราได้รับเกียรตินะคะจากวิทยากรของ IAEA นะคะดร. L Brady นะคะจาก Cincinnati Children's Hospital เป็นหัวหน้านักฟิสิกส์นะคะที่ Cincinnati Children's Hospital ซึ่งจะมาเล่าให้เราฟังถึงในเรื่องของการจัดทำโดสในเรื่องของ DRL นะคะหรือ Dose Reference Levels นะคะแล้วก็มาเล่าให้เราฟังถึงในเรื่องของการที่จะเมื่อเราได้ค่า DRL ออกมาแล้วเนี่ยค่ะของประเทศเนี่ยเราจะเอามาใช้ยังไงในชีวิตประจำวันเราจะมาแปลผลยังไงนะคะนอกจากนั้นเนี่ยเรายังได้รับเกียรติจากอาจารย์ปราณฤทัยตรีนวรัตน์นะคะซึ่งเป็นหนึ่งในบุคคลที่ช่วยเราในการเก็บโดสนะคะแล้วก็เป็นหัวหอกสำคัญเลยที่ช่วยในการร่วมกับกรมวิทย์นะคะแล้วก็ทางปสเนี่ยในการที่รวบรวมโดสออกมาแล้วก็มาเอามาใช้นะคะยังไงก็ขอสวัสดีทั้งสองท่านค่ะ Good evening Sam and สวัสดีค่ะอาจารย์ปานสวัสดีค่ะนะคะ so please welcome Dr. Brady who is a chief medical physicist from Cincinnati Children's Hospital and also IAEA expert. He's going to give a talk about how to establish those reference level. Please welcome.
Thank you for the welcome. Hopefully one day I'll understand every word you say, Tanya. So I'm grateful to be back. I am just bringing my screen up so you can all see.
In the meantime, we are going to have your PDF lectures put in the link from the IAOC. So people who register to get like a Zoom link, they can access your PDF lectures from last week and this week and also future week.
Great.
Just want to give a heads up to the audience. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Yes. In the future, as I spoke with Tanya, the goal will be to get my lectures out beforehand. So you'll have a chance to have them before if you want to look at them, if you have questions, and then you'll be prepared for questions, but also you can use them to take notes. So we will work on that. So once again, I'm grateful to be here, to be a part of this talk, this project where I'm working with the Thai government and working with all these wonderful experts from Thailand. It's a wonderful process that they have been going through. It's been many years in the making, and so it's really exciting to now start seeing all the fruits of all these efforts after 4 or 5 years. And so I'm grateful to be invited to share a few slides today. I'm going to talk about how to establish diagnostic reference levels, or DRLs. And so last week we really talked very broadly. We talked about radiation dose. We talked about some very broad subjects. And now what we're going to do is we're going to distill that down into 2 topics today: how to establish DRLs and then how to use DRLs. And then, as you may recall from last week, after today, we are going to then focus on each modality individually. We're actually going to spend a fair amount of time, all of next month, the month of March, focusing on CT. And after CT, then we'll go back through X-ray, mammography, and fluoroscopy. So once again, today is going to still be a little bit more of a broad topic. And so you may have very specific questions about modalities, and I'm very happy to do my best to answer them. But know that as we ask very specific questions about, for example, X-ray or CT, know that we will have a chance to really get deep into those topics in the coming weeks. So to start off with about how to establish DRLs, why do we even have DRLs? Well, the ICRP, which is an international committee that has been around for almost, I think, 100 years or so, and they have set up 3 pillars, or 3 major ideas on how we should look at the idea of dose mitigation. And so the first pillar is recognition of stochastic effects, or in other words, what is the risk from exposure to ionizing radiation. And we talked quite a bit about this last week, the idea that there are tissue effects, of course. We can damage our tissue, we can get erythema and epilation, and depending on the severity or the level of the exposure, it also correlates with the severity. But then the other effect, which we all know is stochastic, or the risk from cancer, which can lead, can be anything from induction of cancer to actually leading to mortality. So the ICRP says that we need to take into account uncertainties about the risk and the irreversibility of these effects. And so it is prudent to reduce exposure to the lowest possible level. And so it's important that we talk quite a bit about the understanding of the risk effect at the high level. We all know that, unfortunately, because of the atomic weapons that were used in World War II, we've had many years of following those populations, the survivors of the exposure from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we understand very well the high end of the dose level or the exposure level, but we don't quite know at the very low end, which is what we use for medicine. That said, it's prudent to reduce this exposure level as low as possible to do our best to mitigate this risk, because as it says, it's irreversible, the effects. Now, that said, no matter what we do, we will never be able to reduce risk to zero. So there is always going to be some inherent risk from exposure to radiation. So the second pillar is justification. The risk from using ionizing radiation should be balanced with medical benefit. And we recognize that every day when we operate in the radiology and interventional labs. Excuse me. So what we need to do is define the appropriate benefit, that idea of benefit to risk ratio. And where possible, we need to consider a LARA, which is defined as low as reasonably achievable. So we want to try to keep our imaging doses as low as possible, but then we have to ask the question, is there a point where too low is not appropriate or does not provide the appropriate benefit? So there is that balance of too high and too low, and so we need to be able to balance that against the idea of justification. And then the third and final pillar is economic and social considerations. In this case, the recommendation to keep exposures as low as readily achievable must be balanced with the effort to achieve reduced medical dose levels and versus the actual risk from inherently low dose from diagnostic medical imaging procedures. In other words, is it worth driving the dose so close to zero when the dose is already so low that the risk is very, very small? And if we consider the amount of effort, the economic effort, the social effort to drive those doses down, is there a diminishing return in our efforts? So when you look at and consider those three pillars, diagnostic reference levels, or DRLs, actually provide a very effective solution to addressing all three of them. And so that is why, as time has gone on, really since the early 70s, when we started talking about this idea of having these general diagnostic reference levels or thresholds, that we can use these to help address these three pillars. So diagnostic reference levels, or DRLs, establish a benchmark from which all scanners can be compared. They're based on typical examinations, based on standard sized patients in the population. They're based on scanner type. And what that means is we're trying to compare similar scanners. So if you have single slice scanners, you don't want to compare those to 320 slice scanners. And so there is a certain amount of grouping of data. But when you consider how we can take all of this data and we can just kind of group it together, this gives us the opportunity to now start to see if the usage of one particular scanner is out of line with a more global benchmark. So the assumptions made when we establish diagnostic reference levels are DRLs are used in medical imaging to indicate whether in routine conditions the levels of patient dose from or administered activity, which when we're dealing with nuclear medicine, obviously we inject RAM into our bodies, for a specified imaging procedure are unusually high or low for that procedure. So I think this is an important point to establish. Dose reference levels simply draw a line. They draw a line in the sand. And what we're trying to say is anything to one side is low and to one side is high. And as we will go on, we're not trying to say that this line is inherently good or bad. We're just simply trying to make a point, a threshold, so that we have something to compare to. And that is really the whole extent of a diagnostic reference level. And now there are two words here that I colored. The first is routine. There are a lot of imaging techniques, protocols, procedures, and some of them can be very tailored and specialized. When a radiologist needs a little extra or a special tool for their diagnostic task, sometimes we have very unique diagnostic protocols for that. And those you will obviously, you can appreciate, are not going to be will not make good diagnostic reference levels because they're so unique. Very few other institutions in Thailand would probably use those. So the best thing we can do is we can find something that's routine, that is common among most imaging centers throughout the nation, so that when we compare that one or multiple routine protocols, we have a way to just get a good sample of how that overall imaging clinic is doing. Now, that's not to say that every protocol is properly optimized. That's not to say that every protocol is going to have the same concept of too low or too high dose. It just is a way to sample that if maybe these routine conditions are being met, they are within a, they're either low or high on the diagnostic reference level threshold. That is to say that probably everything else is going to be in somewhat of a similar flux. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to find the unusually high and unusually low values. That is to say that there will be some in the middle. And we're going to talk about what that means. But diagnostic reference levels are really good at finding the extremes and helping us to fix the extremes. So where can I find a good summary or reference to how to establish diagnostic reference levels? So the vast majority of my talk today, and both this very set of slides and the one that will follow in the coming hour, is taken from the ICRP publication 135, Diagnostic Reference Levels. So hopefully everyone has access to this. If not, I'm sure we can work with the IAEA to try to get everyone access to this very document. This document was written and has been updated after several years. The latest version is 2017, so this is a relatively new document, and it has step-by-step action levels on how to establish a diagnostic reference level and suggestions on how to interpret them. And so today I'm basically going to distill that, I can't remember, several hundred-page document into 2 talks. So prior to establishing national DRLs, the ICRP 135 report states that, or strongly suggests, that national legislative bodies should clearly identify organizations that are responsible for different components of collecting DRL data. And so I think it's important that we have a central focused power or authority that can help collect the group and keep the group focused. If we have some academics in one institution in Bangkok and another one in a completely different part of Thailand working, then there's going to be confusion, miscommunication, and ultimately there may be results that do not come together. So having a centralized authority to help guide and direct this is probably the very first step. And so in that, it can either be passed as legislature or law, or it can be just a matter of setting up a central group. And I know, for example, you have the AOP, right? The Atomic Office of, forgive me, I can't remember the IOP, AOP. I can't remember the acronym now, but I know that you guys have established that, and I know that they are going to be the clearinghouse for all of the national DRLs going forward. And so you guys have this set up, and you have established the correct personnel to run this. And we're going to hear from Dr. Panrutai a little bit later, as she's done a phenomenal job kind of getting all of the building blocks put into place and having the first 4 or 5 years worth of data coming out, and obviously establishing the roles. And then ultimately this government body will then have the legitimacy to go and ask all of the various different hospitals and clinics to participate. And so that's why it's really important to have a kind of a single voice that will help guide the establishment of national DRLs. All right, so who can undertake the survey? Who should be the one that will begin the survey and collect this data? So the ICRP indicates that it could be as high as a government institution or health authorities and maybe a institution within the government. It could be based in a professional society or scientists. It could be individual academic institutions, hospitals, or it could even be as simple as local radiology facilities or standalone clinics. Now, we're talking going from global government down to individuals. Now, I went in this order on purpose because as we go through today, I think you realize that when it starts with DRLs, the very first step to establishing DRLs is we're actually going to work the inverse. It's much easier when you start and you work with local hospitals and local clinics to start collecting data, and then using larger academic institutions to start understanding and analyzing this data, and then having the next step where professional societies and eventually government institutions will then take over, and they can help bring all of the nation together. So the staff within these organizations usually will comprise of technologically savvy people, so medical physicists, lead technologists. You have the clinicians who are the radiologists. They're the people that understand the clinical side of the equation. And then you will have a support structure, staff that will be assigned the data collection, data analysis, and potentially, if you move the direction, to maybe do accreditation. And so you have a technical, a clinical, and then you have the support structure to actually to bring all the data together and analyze it. So where should we begin? As I mentioned, you can start at the top and you can wait for the government to establish everything and put everything together. And, even in the best of worlds, most governments just don't have the ability to create a global large project and make it work from the beginning. So it's always better to start small and local and work your way up. And so the first thing you can do is you can actually divide the country up into regions, and you can start focusing locally. And so one region, let's say centrally around Bangkok, they can start to collect data, and they will collect data. Now that data is going to be only specific to that region. In theory, that data may apply to the data from a northern region or maybe a southern region in Thailand, but we don't know that until we eventually get all the data together. But at least we can start locally, and that local group can start building the infrastructure that will actually help collect national data. And so what we do is we look at these larger hospitals inside a local area, and they can start to collect and look at the dose from a variety of different protocols and the image quality. And in most cases, larger hospitals have the bandwidth to do this. They already maybe have the support structure. The radiologists may have time to work with the technologists and the medical physicists for optimization. And so in many ways, asking them to start to collect this data and to analyze it, they probably already have a lot of this put together. And so once we start collecting the local data, the next step, as we start to compare local data, now we can start looking at the central versus northern versus the southern, we can start to make a little bit more, come to understand a little bit better of how the diagnostic reference levels will affect multiple regions instead of just the local ones. All right, so starting at the local level, you can go as simple and as small as looking at just maybe, for example, x-ray rooms, just a diagnostic reference at x-ray room, looking at 10 or 20 x-ray rooms and collecting common examinations that are performed in just a small sample of x-ray rooms. If you have enough, so if you have a relatively large hospital that may have 10 or 20 x-ray rooms, then you can start to collect the data from them, and you'll have sufficient amount of data that you can start calculating things such as the median of the dose distribution and the first and third quartile. And we have talked quite extensively already in the last week about how the DRL is defined as the third quartile or the 75th percentile of the data. So if you have a large enough pool of data, you can start to collect both the median and that DRL or the third quartile. Now, the third quartile has been simply established as that, as I mentioned, that line in the sand that helps us understand kind of what would be outside of that. And if it's above the third quartile, we can start to call that or consider that an outlier. Now, if you don't have enough, if in that region, that local region, you don't have 10 to 20 x-ray rooms where you can collect a sufficiently large population of data, then you won't be able to necessarily calculate all of the statistics that you need, because if you just have a small population, it probably won't be robust enough to look at the extremes. But you can at least still calculate the median, the middle average of the data. All right. Now, yeah, that's what I just said. If there's only a few examination procedures, you can only use the median value for comparison. All right. So one thing you'll notice as you start collecting locally, and then as they will then eventually be compared to national values, local DRLs will typically be different than the national DRLs. They generally can be lower, especially if we're acquiring them in larger academic institutions. So here's a table from ICRP 135, table 2.2. If you have that document, you can always reference it on page 45. And this gives you an understanding of kind of what type of data can be used. So if you have a small healthcare with a few x-ray rooms and a small number of specialized protocols, we just said this, you can only really use the median value of that simple dose distribution to understand your data spread. And this data can only be used at that local institution or that local hospital. It's too specialized to start comparing it to other hospitals in that region. The next level, which would be kind of the local region. So now we're talking multiple, maybe, Bangkok's a very large city, but maybe in a smaller setting, you'll have multiple cities where you have a few hospitals. Now you can start to pool larger amounts of x-ray rooms, 10 to 20, as we indicated in the last slide. And from that, you can now establish both the median and the third quartile of your data. And these values can now be compared locally to all the hospitals in that region. As time goes on, as we start to collect data from multiple localities, you can then, of course, combine that nationally. And this becomes now something that's representative of similar facilities all over the country. And once again, you can now use the median value and the third quartile. And this is where you start to make that nationwide, and you can identify which facilities need to be optimized compared to the national standard. And then once you've established national DRLs, so we have Thai DRLs, it's good to actually look into the larger international region. So now you can look at several countries, maybe in the Indochina Peninsula. Maybe you can start to compare to local regions such as India, or you can go down into like Malaysia. Obviously, there are other Asian countries. China, no doubt, has their own. Japan, Korea, etc. And so as you start to look at other like or similar populations, you can have an understanding of how your DRLs, how they match up to other people's DRLs. And so as you establish your DRL, you kind of need to understand, is this a good DRL or a bad DRL? Does it skew high or does it skew low? And we'll actually talk about on that next talk. So the progression is from small individual clinics, specialized clinics, local clinics, national, and then international. All right. So which examinations and or procedures should we use to calculate or collect for DRLs? As we've already mentioned, they have to be common examinations. And there should be a priority given to which type of examination should be collected. So the very obvious and probably the easiest one to do is to start setting DRLs for the highest or the most commonly acquired exam procedures. So if you do standard upright AP 2-view chest in your digital radiograph room, then that's a wonderful one. But if for whatever reason as an institution you just don't do a lot of that, then that doesn't become a high priority. The other priority would be, of course, the exams or the procedures that produce the highest, potentially the highest patient dose, because then these are the two that will bear the most fruit in optimization. So if you can optimize something that you do hundreds of thousands a year, protocols hundreds of thousands of times a year, well, you're going to make a really big impact on the overall medical population exposure rate. And the same is, even if you don't do a lot of one procedure, but it's a very high dose procedure, you once again are going to make a positive impact on the overall Thai population. So how do we do this? Well, internally, we need to identify what procedures are the high dose procedure, or the exams are the high exams, dose exams, and which ones are frequently used. So for those that have dose tracking software, and I know the Thai government's working on distributing that broadly. Some local hospitals may already have this, but others are probably working on getting this more broadly. This is a wonderful tool, whichever software you choose to use. We talked about there's well over 17 options out there, some open source, so you don't have to wait to pay for or buy some if you want to start now. Others, of course, like this one I'm sharing, the Bear Radiometrics, you actually have to pay for this one, a license for this. Now, beyond a simple dose tracking softwares, we can look at hospital data systems like the hospital informatics system or the HIS or the radiology informatics system or the RIS system. Using those, you can start to identify frequency, which protocol or examination is used more frequently. And then probably the least effective, but is still an option if you need to, is you have your PACS system. And so you can start to run some reports and look at what type of procedures or examinations are used more frequently. This one's going to be a little bit more difficult because the data is there, but you actually have to physically go in and start looking at it, looking at dose reports, looking at radiologist reports, and that can be kind of cumbersome. Ideally, if you have a dose tracking system, that's all already built into it, or you can use your hospital data systems. All right, so usually many options will be required to establish which exam procedures are required most frequently. In other words, of those three options, there may be more, but most likely you're going to use more than just one or two of those. You're going to probably have to bring to bear your various different tools to identify which examinations we should assess. All right, so which ones should we assess? Well, in a perfect world, we're going to look at every examination you perform. It's unrealistic because that's a lot, and some of them we don't use but more than a handful of times a month or a year. So we need to prioritize the examination type. There are some examinations that will be labeled quote unquote lower priority. These obviously are the opposite of what we've talked about. So they have lower contributions to population dose or they are more difficult to survey. So these can be avoided in the early stages of setting up your diagnostic reference level values. Ideally, as you become more expert in doing this, and after you've maybe done multiple, we've talked about in the past where after every about 3 to 5 years, you should resample your data to to make sure your diagnostic reference levels, they may need to be adjusted. And so as you go through multiple different cycles, at some point you become pretty expert on the very common examination types. Now maybe we can look at the less common, or the quote unquote lower priority. Didn't mean to go through that last bullet point, but what this is basically is ICRP report 135, table 2.1. You can find this on page 43. It gives just an example of a variety of different examinations and the type of modalities that we should include on the first setup of diagnostic reference levels. So mammography, digital mammography is a classic example of this. You have your various different dental procedures, your intraoral, your PANS, and your cone beams. And these ones, yes, we should set them up. But now, obviously, CT and a few others, yes. But we come down to, say, for example, radiography, planar radiography. You may do a lot of extremity work, but this is potentially going to be a lower priority. So maybe not the first time through. Why? Well, obviously doses to extremities are low. Our risk from imaging an arm or a hand or a finger is much, much lower than if we do a chest, abdomen, or our head. But the other thing is, as I just kind of mentioned it, there are a lot of different types of extremities. And so to categorize, quote unquote, an extremity is actually a very difficult task. So it's one of those, let's catch this on the next cycle or maybe the third cycle, when once we have established the entire infrastructure, so we can actually be a little bit more specific and we have a better way of determining upper or lower extremity, hand and feet versus finger, etc. Now, pediatrics is a big yes. You see that there, but it's also a difficult one. And so there are times where we will set as a higher priority something that is inherently difficult. Pediatrics is difficult, as you can imagine, because we have to stratify and understand the various different sizes. Kids can go from neonatal to obese, and that will run the entire spectrum of size and weight. So we have kids on here, and obviously I work at a children's hospital, so it's partial to me that we include them, but they are difficult. And so through the first pass, it may be difficult to establish many national DRLs for pediatrics in many different imaging modalities. Excuse me. Here in the United States, we have been working on collecting dose data for well over a decade or two now, and we still don't have national DRLs for pediatrics. We've published a lot of papers. Myself and a few of my colleagues here at various different pediatric hospitals are trying to get it established. We hope one day it'll be done, but don't worry, because pediatrics is a hard one to cover. So anyway, this table, I cut and pasted it on here. So as you get my slides, you can actually look over this and completely internalize it all. But the point here is that there are some priorities that we need to establish. All right, the next step we need to worry about or consider is that we have to be able to compare apples to apples. And we talked a little bit about this last time, about how the naming structure. And so one institution may call a upright two-view chest different. They may call it PA chest or chest, who knows what they are. They may just have different identifications. And so we need to be able to understand what hospital A calls a two-view chest, an upright two-view chest, and hospital B calls. And so as we identify which specific examination procedures we want to create for the DRLs, we then need to identify a way to understand what is considered similar. And so we look at ways to do this. One of the easiest ways to do this is based on technologies. So if you have a radiographic room, well, a digital radiographic room is going to be different than a plain film. And so grouping these two by technology is great. And in CT, if you have one slice versus, as I mentioned before, 320 slice. But once you get into even smaller nuances, you may have two 64 slice CT scanners, but one may have one specific reconstruction algorithm and another a completely different one. And so it can be difficult when you start to try to group these because the doses will vary based on technology, based on the type of the scanner, etc. And you don't want to break your DRLs into so many small stratified groups, because what happens is if you have, I don't know, let's say 300 data points, and now you make 20 different categories, well, now you're maybe only getting 10 or 15 or 20 data points in each category. And so you don't have sufficient to do your calculations. And so you have to understand and weigh the pros and cons of grouping. Maybe you say everything over 64 slice CT scans, even though a 64 and a 320 slice are two different creatures, but they are probably mostly modern CT scanners versus a single slice. And so generally speaking, the dose profile should be mostly similar. Maybe in the future, as you get more and more and more data, then you can start to get a little bit more nuanced. All right, and then we talked about naming, and that's very important. Okay, next step is we have to get a good population sample. We talked a little bit about this last week, so I'm not going to really kind of focus on this too much. But if you have obviously in the United States here, you can see most of our hospitals are what we call community hospitals. Therefore, they're not teaching academic hospitals. They don't do research. And so they probably won't have the most state-of-the-art CT scanner. They may not have a lot of radiologists that are working on dose optimization and image quality optimization, et cetera. And you may go all the way down to freestanding centers where they don't do any of that. If someone's sick in the community, they go in, they get scanned, and they leave, and that's just all they do. And so there's a variety of types of imaging centers that we have to sample, and we need to sample them with respect to their population. So if there's a lot of community hospitals, we need to sample a lot of community hospitals. If there's only a few academic centers, we don't want to sample all the academic centers because that'll skew our data to not represent the actual population. All right, and so we just mentioned that. Sufficiently diverse, definitely mentioned that. All right, now, what do I mean? I wrote here, where possible, a facility should be validated. What do I mean by that? It's one thing to go and ask all the hospitals in a locality to send me your data on brain CT, on head CTs. And so they all send you the data, and then you look at it, and you realize very quickly there's a huge spread. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you're not making sure that all of the scanners are properly set up right, you're going to get this huge variation of data. It helps if in the initial setup of diagnostic reference levels that people like medical physicists or technologists can make sure that there are basic quality control tests being met. And almost all vendors and all types of modalities require basic quality control. And so I'm not saying that we have to go in and optimize every scanner before we can collect that data, because that's actually not, the DRL is meant to be the complete opposite of that. But we need to make sure the scanner has a basic quality control to it so that it's not so crazy wild that their dose values are completely extreme. And so it's good to have, like I said, technologically based medical physicist or technologists. They're going to go in and they'll help establish the proper QC techniques, and they can, in an ideal world, help establish proper image quality for all of these scanners. Now, if you're not at that level yet, or you don't, for example, have medical physicists that can go into every hospital, or technologists that have the ability or the freedom, the time to do a lot of this work, well, they still collect that data, and then we'll use that data to identify those clinics and hospitals where they definitely need that help. And then we can start to take maybe those people like the medical physicists, and they can go in and they can focus on that one hospital. So in an ideal world, it would already be established, but don't worry, we will still use that data to help isolate the extremes in the data population. All right, so what type of patient should we use? I said that there is going to be kind of an ideal patient population that we use for DRLs. So we know that when it comes to quote unquote patient dose, it depends on the attenuation of the X-ray path. Therefore, a large patient and a small patient will have different dose profiles. So we can't just take all data off of one scanner and accept that and calculate that for a DRL. Because if one scanner images nothing but obese patients and another scanner does nothing but neonatal patients, the dose levels be so different that they're not comparable. So we need to establish a typical patient size, and that will then become the surrogate for our data. So for adults, we typically are going to restrict that to a weight category. So we might say that when we're collecting data for the DRLs, we will only accept patients that weigh between 50 and 90 kilos. That's just an example. So it could be 70 kilos plus or minus 10, 70 kilos plus or minus 20. It's something that you have to identify. And I say that because when you go and you look at the Thai population as a whole, you may realize that they are different than, say, the United States or the European population. So in the US, we have a large population that is frankly obese. And so therefore, if I set my average at 70 kilos, it might be too small or too low. That's an unfortunate thing, but it just might not represent the population being imaged in the US. Whereas maybe in Thailand, 70 kilos might actually be too big. So you need to look at your population and you need to determine what is the quote unquote average or typical body habitus. Now for adults, that's pretty simple. We're going to basically establish one point. For kids, we can't do that. Obviously, we need to stratify kids. Kids grow a lot. They change quite a bit. So if you're under 5 kilos versus a 30 kilo kid, pediatric patient, those dose profiles are going to be different. Here I give once again an example of ICRP 135, table 6.1 on page 93, if you'd like to find it. They simply quote, because the ICRP is a European-based entity, they quote what the Europeans use for their guideline. And this is how they stratify their pediatric patients: by weight or by age. Now, there are just the very common age category stratifications that probably most people use, 0, 1-year-old, 5-year-old, 10-year-old, 15-year-old, and then what that would be associated with as a weight category. Now you can see that, for example, they go up to 80 kilograms. Obviously, after that, most protocols are what we would say, quote unquote, adult size protocols. So if you're already collecting 70 kilos plus or minus 10, 20 kilos for adults, then generally speaking, you'll have your pediatric as a sub or a smaller version of that, or lower weight category stratification. And you don't necessarily need to set a pediatric population at or greater than 70, 80, or 90 kilos. All right. We talked about what type of dose metrics we need to collect. So let's just talk very briefly in the larger picture of what the ICRP states. So they say, like we said last week, they have to be practical. So within reason, can we collect this data? It shouldn't be a 10 or 15 step process. It shouldn't require manual calculations. It has to be something that we can simply collect. So it has to be practicable. It needs to be based on direct measurement. And so it's something like air kerma that we'll talk about, but it's something that can be physically measured and verified. Obviously, it needs to come from the imaging equipment, and it needs to indicate the amount of radiation used, so the output of the machine, or, for example, in nuclear medicine or PET, how much we actually will administer into the patient intravenously. So I showed you this, and it is meant to just demonstrate the complexity of the problem. Every modality shown here in different colors basically has a different metric associated with it. There are a few overlaps, like you see here in fluoroscopy and X-ray, where air kerma and cap or DAP, those are there, but there's still unique values across the board. And so it's not just one metric that we can use for all of our DRLs. We actually have to set up different metrics for all of the different modalities. And that just means we have lots of tables, lots of different ways to approach calculating our DRLs. This is a table, table 2.3 from ICRP 135, can be found on page 51. And we all basically know what the metrics are called. Air kerma is air kerma. But if you go out, the international committee, so the ICRP uses another committee called the ICRU, and the ICRU has defined what each symbol looks like. So air kerma, so there's the incident air kerma, there's the exposure air kerma, there's the reference air kerma. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, air kerma is air kerma, right? It's true. It just depends on where we make the measurement. Is it going to be incident? Is it going to be the skin, the entrance skin dose? Or is it going to be some point somewhere along the beam path that is called the reference point? And then, of course, there's the other ones like volume CTDI, mean glandular dose. I just simply give this to you. It gives you the symbol that you'll oftentimes see in the international literature, obviously what it's called, and common names that we have been using and probably will continue to use for many years. And here the list just keeps going. And also it gives the units. So something that you've probably seen quite a bit, like air kerma, however you list it, its units are going to be in milligray. It also talks about other recommended quantities. And so obviously there's air kerma, and air kerma is kind of ubiquitous, especially among the planar radiographic areas like X-ray, fluoro, and dental and mammography. But there are some, for example, like fluoroscopy time, because it's a dynamic imaging technique. So in some cases, we may actually collect fluoroscopy time. And I'll give an example of why we do that, because it's not ideal, but sometimes we need to do that. And then, of course, here we go. Here's the rest of the table. So I'm not going to read all of this. Once again, I simply cut and pasted it here for your ability. And once you get my slides, if you're really interested, you can read all of this and understand all of the various different types of metrics, their units, and what they're called or referred to internationally. All right, so I also gave you this slide last time. I just want to simply quickly remind you that when it comes to calculating DRLs, effective dose is not appropriate. We can use that for publications. We can use that when we're doing local internal hospital comparisons. But when it comes to setting a DRL, we do not use effective dose. And there's two reasons for that. One, it's not measurable. And two, it does not relate to the output of a machine. So the IAEA, I just simply remind you what they recommend, since obviously this is an IAEA sponsored symposium. So for radiography, dental, and digital mammography or tomosynthesis, they recommend air kerma. Obviously for mammography, you got your mean glandular dose also. Fluoroscopy, they recommend air kerma reference point and or cap. And then a CT, there's the volume CTDI and DLP. I talked to you a little bit about last time how I believe SSD or size specific dose estimate is a really good one to have. In the past, the IAEA and the ICRP haven't recommended that. SSD admittedly is relatively new. I think as time goes on, they will add that to their list. So for now, probably not, but probably in the future, I think it'll be a very important metric. And then of course, nuclear medicine, they want you to collect the data based on the amount of the injected radionuclide per body weight. So we set these DRL values for multiple quantities. It's not always simple just to collect the data for one metric. So we mentioned, for example, fluoroscopy, there's air kerma reference point, there's cap, and there could be as simple as collecting just the fluoroscopy time. So why collect more than one metric? Well, first of all, that allows flexibility. Not all hospitals have the most state-of-the-art technology. And I gave you fluoroscopy as an example because fluoroscopy, it can have everything from dose maps with dose rate indicated on the monitor and a variety of different like peak skin dose, air kerma values. It can be as simple as only having reference air kerma here, you can see. And if you go to your legacy imaging devices, your older systems, they may not list any of that, and it might just be fluoro time. So to collect data from a wide spectrum of imaging modalities used at all the hospitals in Thailand, we need to be flexible. Does that mean we need to collect all of this data the very first time? Maybe not, because that is a lot of data, and then that requires a lot of comparisons. It might be that we pick the most common, that is the most ubiquitous across all modalities, and that would probably be air kerma. But as we go back through, maybe on the second cycle or maybe the third cycle, it's helpful to start to collect different dose metrics, air kerma, and maybe then next time cap, as an example. It's very important that we understand that the value that we receive is accurate. And so this goes back to the couple of slides ago. I said it's helpful to make sure each of these modalities, each of these systems, the machines, are working properly, that there's some basic QC involved. So I give you the example of CT. It gives you the value in the dose report of volume CTDI and DLP, or dose length product. Well, those are values that can be measured based on an ion chamber and a CTDI phantom. And so it's helpful to know that the value displayed on the scanner and ultimately recorded on the dose report is accurate based on something that we can physically measure. And so this is why we only collect dose metrics that we can measure so that we can verify them. And it's helpful if you have the ability to make sure that the system has been verified and it is accurate. And that gives you confidence in your data, because once you get the data, you want to know that if there is a wide spread, well, is it because the machine is working properly, or is it not working properly? But if you know the machine's working properly, well, you just now know that that machine has got a larger output, and it helps simplify your task. All right, initial survey options. So we've talked about if you have the ability, you want 10 or 20 of any one machine type in a locality, so multiple different hospitals, and that gives you a sufficiently large population to start making median and third quartile or DRL calculations. If you don't have that, the bare minimum is looking at a few imaging techniques and 20 to 30 patients for fluoro diagnostic, digital radiography or film radiography and CT. And for mammography, it'd be 50. So once again, that's the bare minimum that the ICRP has established to help start collecting data. And then you want to do at least 20 or 30 facilities at that level. So 20 or 30 facilities where you get 20 to 30 patients of these three modalities and 50 for mammography. Ideally, the next step through, as you start to cycle on your next time, 3 to 5 years, you move away from manual data collection, where you're sending out surveys, which we talked about last week, asking them to fill in the data and send it back, either electronic or paper. It's very cumbersome because now you need a staff that will take that data, they will be able to input that data and then analyze it. As Thailand moves towards having electronic dose registry, where you have dose monitoring software at multiple locations, then that data now will start to feed into the calculation of DRLs in almost a real-time or constant basis. So once we have collected this data, what do we do? How do we make sense of the results? So the first thing we need to do is understand the data distribution. We need to remove nonsensical or extreme outlier data. A few very high values from incorrect data entry So if you're still doing manual entry, they may have accidentally, instead of wrote 0.02, they might have wrote 20. Who knows? It's a complete opposite value. But incorrect data entry, and or potentially, instead of giving you a patient that was within 50 to 90 kilos, they gave you someone that was 140 kilos. And so accidents and mistakes happen, but we need to be able to identify those so we can remove them for the statistical calculations. Now, if you have access to statistical software, that's wonderful, because there are a lot of different tests, statistical tests out there. Hopefully you just employ a statistician. That individual or individuals will be able to do all the various different calculations that you need. Very basic statistical calculations would include doing what's called an interquartile range, where you look at the data spread and you look at the third quartile and the first quartile, and you take the difference of that. That's called the interquartile range. That will give you an estimate of the spread of data at the center of your distribution. More sophisticated methods may include, for example, maximum normalized residual test. So basically what that means is you look at a normally distributed population and it will help you identify what are considered extremes. If none of these are a possibility, for whatever reason, you just don't have access to the statistical software or the know-how, a very simple way to do this is do what's called an ordered distribution, where you plot the data and you just simply take it from the lowest data point to the highest data point, and you put it in sequence, in order. And what does that do? Well, it helps you find these tails. It helps you find the extreme lows and the extreme highs. And it helps you find these inflection points. So from everything from probably here to here is distributed in a way that you would probably say, yeah, this is a low number, this is a high number, but it's within a reasonable distribution. But when you get this strong inflection and you get data that goes from reasonable to extreme in a matter of a few patients, then you know that there's probably some extreme nature in this data. Larger patients than what was supposed to be, or like we said, someone accidentally changed a number on the form. And so you can reasonably remove these values at the extremes to give you a better, more robust analysis for DRL calculations. This is just another way to look at it. So this was CT, looking at dose length products. This is just a planar radiography. Now you're looking at entrance surface dose for a chest PA or an abdominal AP projection. And so you see the normal distribution. You can see the solid line, which is the median, the dashed line, which is the mean. And then you can see a couple different hospitals grouped here. The data obviously is well localized here at these large histogram, kind of on the left side, but you have all of these crazy outliers out here. And so this helps you very quickly visually see which data is an outlier. So the common metric to assess for the what are common metrics that we assess for DRL quantity? Well, we need to calculate the amount of ionizing radiation used in the examination. So we've talked quite extensively about using the median value. And then we've also talked quite extensively about how the DRL is defined as the 75th percentile. Now, why the 75th percentile? Well, it was simply deemed as a useful marker, but it is, or was, and still is, a very arbitrary value. There is no scientific basis that if a hospital's head CTDI vol values are higher than the 75th percentile or the third quartile, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are garbage, horrible, bad images or too high a dose that then the risk is unacceptable. It's just that we simply said the third quartile will make the line in the sand. And then we need to go, and we'll talk about this quite extensively in the next talk, what is considered good for the high and the low. So let's just answer this quick question. Why the median value? So here I have the three most common average values you can calculate in statistics. There's the mode, which is the value the most frequent value. So when you have a distribution, it's the point that's the most frequently used. The median, which is the point that is exactly in the middle of the distribution. So there's always going to be 50% of the data to the left of it and 50% to the right of it. And then there's the mean, which is what most people think about as an average, where you take the entire distribution and you take the average of it. So why not use the mean? So here I have two distributions, this purple dashed line and then this purple solid line. And this, and I just took it from this website, so it's not my data, but here they simply listed or showed the mode, the median, and the mean. So let's look at the mean. The mean of this dashed purple distribution is all the way out here. And the mean of this purple distribution is right here. So those two means are significantly different. They're different because you can see this dashed one has a large right skew. So there's a larger amount of high numbers or high values, which skews the data right. Whereas this solid one tends to be more normally distributed. It looks more Gaussian. Now let's look at the median. The median of the dashed purple one is right here. So 50% of the data is on this side, 50% is on this side. And lo and behold, the median for this distribution is also right here. In this example, this is purely just an example, the medians from these two populations are identical. And so this is why we choose the median, because the median is less sensitive to extreme data on the left or the right. Because it's simply just the middle value. All right. So the 75th percentile of the national median distribution values. So we use the 75th percentile of the national median distributions, but what distribution do you use? The simple pooling of data from surveys is no longer satisfactory. What does that mean? We don't necessarily want to just simply take all the data given and just pool it all together. We need to correlate it some way. And so the ICRP suggests that we consider different ways to group the data. So as an example, we should try to find a way to correlate the dose with image quality. How do we do that? We're not collecting image quality metrics. We talked about that last week, and it would be a perfect world to marry those two sets of population data, but we don't. So what's another metric that we can use to help us understand what would be a surrogate for image quality? Well, the 75th percentile is obviously the third quartile. And then there's the 50th percentile, which is the median value. And so what they have done, the ICRP has called this the achievable dose. So if you look at a population and you take it and you look at it and you say, all right, if I have the median value here and the 75th percentile here, well, that means at the median value, 50% of the hospitals that submitted data are receiving or are able to achieve this dose. Whatever that dose is, we know at least 50% of them can do that. Obviously, the 75th percentile means 75% can do that. So if 50% can get this dose, then maybe that 25% that is higher could work towards better optimization to bring those doses down. So that's why they call it an achievable value. It's something that is a goal to work towards. So it's not a direct correlation to image quality, but it acts as a second point, a second line that we're drawing in the sand to help guide us to pick which optimization we should work towards. All right, and that's basically what I just said. So in conclusion, let me just quickly wrap up. There were a lot of points made in this talk. So first, we're going to begin by collecting regional dose values, and then we'll work towards, when I said regional, I should have wrote local. Local values, then regional, then national, and of course, then international. So we're going to base this on single surveys where representative facilities drawn from this locality. If enough data points are collected, then we can do the median value and the 75th percentile. If not enough, then at best we have at least a median value. And then prior to collection of the data, it is ideal, and the ICRP recommends it, that a medical physicist or a similar technologically specialized individual can go in and ensure that the imaging equipment is properly functioning, that it has a basic or minimum QC level established, so that you have confidence in the dose metrics that will come from that machine. We then will combine the regional dose values and establish national DRLs. And we're going to collect this data for very specific examinations and procedures. And we're going to begin with the highest priority exams and procedures, which typically include exams that are most frequently used and exams that have the highest patient dose. If the data sampling is sufficient, and hopefully it is at a national level, then you can calculate the 50th percentile, the median, which is the achievable dose, and the 75th percentile, which is, of course, the national DRL. And then we're going to establish the next step after that is establish an electronic data repository so that we can do ongoing cyclical every 3 to 5 years data collection for DRL analysis. And then finally, we can introduce image quality into the analysis. And so we said how AD kind of acts as a rough surrogate, but ultimately we need to find a way to correlate the dose that we're collecting and correlate that to image quality. And I think we'll talk mostly about that in my next talk on how we can then use the DRL for optimization. All right, thank you for attending this talk. I believe, Tanya, will have time for short questions now before we move on. Okay, so I am more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Sam, for give us the overview and also basic background on the diagnostic reference levels. I like your explanation about mean, median, and mode, because that one is confusing me a lot. Because when we trying to say about like a DRL, and people said this is 75 percentile, and it's still in my mind why we need to do that median number and 75% percentile. So this makes sense to me now, like because 75 percentile of the median value is 50% on low and high level. So I think this explains a lot in terms of the basic background on this thing. And I think for Thailand, we have done a lot of this thing already in terms of like a survey as like a manual correction data. Also, we have a Ministry of Public Health to help with the national data collections and many things. So, Ajahn Pan, do you have any comments or you want to go for the next talk now?
I think the very clear lecture from the ICRP and the audience will much easier than reading the ICRP yourself.
It was a long document. I hope you enjoyed it.
Quite sleepy when reading that.
It is it's a good way to put yourself to sleep.
Mm-hmm.